I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar. My name is Ryan Rodriguez. I am the Customer Engagement Manager for BMJ here in the Americas. I'm really excited to have you all join us here today to learn more about BMJ Case Reports. Before I begin, I'd like to say good afternoon. For those of you that are calling in or dialing into this webinar from the West Coast, good morning. Today, we're going to be expanding on BMJ Case Reports. And I'll just say that we have a very special guest who has joined us from overseas, Dr. Seema Biswas, who is BMJ's Case Reports Editor-in-Chief. So we're very excited to have her join us today. We're going to cover quite a few things during the next 45 minutes. I won't spend too much time on our overview of BMJ, but I'll give you some quick insights and then turn things over, expanding a little bit more on BMJ Case Reports, why it's such a valuable title, part of BMJ's portfolio, and why our customers truly appreciate and with all honesty, love BMJ Case Reports. And then, of course, turn things over to the reason why you're all here, which is to hear more directly from the Editor-in-Chief, Dr. Biswas, and she's going to expand a little bit more on her sort of perspective on what she's looking for to get published and shared with the rest of the world and how it supports clinical learning. And throughout the presentation, if there are any questions, please submit them. We'll have some time at the end of the webinar to address those questions. If we can't get to them, no worries. We will reach out to you and respond to them as quickly as possible. I will say that the session is being recorded, so as soon as the video is available, we will go ahead and share the video with you so that you can come back and hear my voice all over again, and of course, share the video with the rest of your colleagues in case you want to come back and review some things. So with that, let's begin. Let's talk a little bit more about BMJ. So for those of you that are already our customers, thank you so much. You are the reason why we are here today. And for those of you that are not too familiar with BMJ, we're formerly known as the British Medical Journal, and we have been publishing for over 180 years. We are one of the most trusted sources when it comes to healthcare knowledge and information. And up on the screen right now, you're looking at our very first impact report that we released last year. It's all available online with some big highlights, right, and some figures that you can see here. For me, the most important one is the serving 10 million users online every single month. And that is quite an incredible feat that we were able to accomplish over the past 2 years, 2 very difficult years as a result of the pandemic. But because BMJ has remained constant in delivering reliable and trusted healthcare knowledge, we more than doubled the amount of users that were coming onto our product sites to expand their knowledge. And I think that's one thing that I'm very proud of. But we are really here to focus on what makes BMJ unique. And I think that for me, being a values-driven organization, of course, these 5 core values all feed into our overall mission, which is creating a healthier world. And that is true in everything that we do and in all of our products, including BMJ Case Reports. But if you take a look at the red circle over here, being patient-centered and customer-focused, you know, customers being you, so again, we thank you for that, but being patient-centered has really been one of the key aspects that makes BMJ Case Reports truly unique. And Dr. Biswas is going to expand a little bit more on that, on how we always weave in the patient perspective into these clinical cases. Which brings me to BMJ Case Reports. And the way I like to describe BMJ Case Reports, it's like 3 products in one. It's like 3 different features and characteristics that make BMJ Case Reports one of the more exciting products in the BMJ portfolio that we have. Number 1, it is a journal. Yeah, it's online only. You subscribe like any other journal. It launched in 2008. All of the articles are indexed in PubMed, in Medline, Google Scholar. All of the articles obviously go through the peer review process that BMJ is known for to maintain the quality. And as you can see in these arrows, you can see that there's always a learning perspective and there's always that patient perspective, which, as I mentioned before, Dr. Biswas is going to expand a little bit more. So as a journal, it's very similar to any other journal. But because it has so many clinical cases, and we've over come this threshold over here of 25,000 clinical cases. I think we're now at over 26,000. It also mimics sort of like a database, and it's currently the largest collection of clinical cases in the entire world. Like I mentioned before, over 26,000. So if you go onto the homepage of Case Reports, you will see that it sort of mimics what a database will look like. You have this search bar right here, and additional search functionality directly below it, so that you can browse all the clinical cases that we have. If you want to look at specialty specific clinical cases, you want to see what was recently published, what's most read globally, some of the responses between author and some of the readers, any videos and images. So truly unique in that it is a journal, but also acts as a database. And then the third sort of unique feature that we have about BMJ Case Reports, and probably why you're all here, is that it does provide a pathway to publication. Any institution that subscribes to BMJ Case Reports automatically becomes a fellow. And with that unique fellowship code or fellowship ID, any individual that is part of that institution, whether it's faculty, staff, medical students, researchers, authors, whoever the case may be, and wants to submit into BMJ Case Reports, there are no additional fees to that. They are part of that fellowship. So the subscription pays for all the publication fees that go into BMJ Case Reports. And that doesn't mean that any individual is going to submit and get published. There is, like I mentioned, it does go through peer review. There is a rejection rate. Currently, globally, BMJ Case Reports has about a 44% acceptance rate. In the US and Canada, it's a little higher, it's about 50%. But part of the reason why that's pretty high compared to some other journals is because there are many resources that are on the platform available for authors, including what you can see here. There are templates that you can download and follow that format, and it's ready to submit once you implement and input your information. And we also have patient consent forms in multiple languages, so that you can communicate with the patients who you want to include in these clinical cases and get their consent as well. So there's a lot of resources built in to significantly increase your chances of getting published in BMJ Case Reports. Now, I mentioned that the subscription does cover all the fees. The only additional fee, there's only one, and that is if you want to publish your article open access, and there is a small fee associated with that. But like I said, the rest of any article processing charge, anything associated with that, the subscription pays for itself. So there's no need for authors to pay out of pocket for that. So because I'm talking about publishing, and because you're all here probably to hear less of me and more of Dr. Biswas, let me take this opportunity to introduce her, because we're very excited to have her. Dr. Biswas is a general surgeon and has been the editor-in-chief of BMJ Case Reports for over 10 years. And her research interests include trauma, disaster management, the social determinants of health, and global health. And without any further delay, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Biswas, who is going to expand more on BMJ Case Reports and what she wants to see included. Dr. Biswas, take it away.
Thank you very much indeed. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this webinar. We value very much our relationship with the Americas, and very much our academic relationship with your medical schools and your hospitals. And thank you to BMJ America, the team in New Jersey, for organizing this today. So to the librarians amongst you, residency program directors, clinical tutors, and clinicians who find the time to write, what is it exactly that we're looking for? There are two things to think of, something new for us to learn. I realize that's a challenge to really find something new in day-to-day clinical medicine, but I'll explain in a moment how that's not the challenge that you think it might be. Secondly, as Ryan alluded to it already in that red box you saw in the BMJ plan in general, we are, of all journals, patient-centered. No case report exists without the central case, and that case is a patient. And in addition to reporting the story of the patient, you, of course, have the opportunity of involving the patient in the writing itself. Now, what do those two add up to? What does something new to learn and being patient-centered add up to? They add up to what I was taught was bedside learning, where you're beside the clinical teacher at the side of the bed. You can talk to the patient directly. You can learn from your mistakes. You can learn from each other. The patient can give you his or her perspective, and it's all bedside teaching. Now, bedside teaching isn't as easy as it used to be. Classroom sizes are bigger. It's harder to share information, harder to keep examination confidential, harder to protect a patient's privacy. So what we're providing in this evolving world of medical learning is online bedside learning, where all the information you could possibly need to really know the inside workings of a case and the decision making and the challenges that you encounter are all there in one single manuscript. So let me explain to you again what I mean by online bedside learning as we go through some examples together. The very first thing I want you to do is I want you to think of a normal day at work. You're on the floor, you're in your department, or you're in your clinic, or you're in the emergency room, and there's a patient there in front of you. While you're managing that patient, while you're looking after that patient, ask yourself, is there something that I will take from this case for my own learning and that I would naturally, over a cup of coffee, share with my colleagues? Well, we are your colleagues, this larger world of medical learning. Share that with us. So it's a patient that's right there in front of you. And then involve your patient from the start. If you know that there is something here that you want to share, go to the nearest computer, download and print out a consent form. As Ryan says, you'll find it in almost any language you need. If you can't find it in the language you need there and then, by all means, get in touch with us and we'll make sure we can get a consent form translated and validated, and you can use that. The next thing I want you to do on the computer is download our template from our websites. And I'm sure you'll get the opportunity to play around a little bit and navigate the website yourself. But download the template because it's impossible to get anything wrong if you're following the instructions to the letter. And we have created these templates so that there are instructions where we're almost talking to you in real time, telling you what it is we're looking for. Please, please use formal medical English. We are a global journal, and it is extremely difficult for someone from one part of the world who speaks English in one particular way to understand what someone else is saying. Colloquialisms don't work, humor doesn't work, and use formal medical scientific English. Use scientific names for drugs. Use international units when you're presenting results. Now, just as you would do in a clinical classroom when you're teaching a class of residents or a class of medical students, or you're talking to each other in a grand round, illustrate what you're trying to get over with images and diagrams. Now, we want those images and diagrams to be originals that we can easily publish without any difficulty or delays for you. So it's best that you draw them yourself with some simple computer software on your own computer. Now, anonymizing patient details is something that's important to us and is something that's evolving all the time. In the past, you'll see when you look at our cases that we've published before, that we have the age and occupation of the patient. We have quite a lot of personal details. We have videos that show the patient's home and the patient surrounded by their family. That's changed now, and it's changing all the time. We want you to anonymize the patient as much as you can. Of course, identifying information should be removed from all scans and radiological images. That goes without saying. But in addition to that, when you take videos or you take clinical photographs, we mustn't be able to see the face of the patient. And a single black line across the eyes doesn't hide the patient from us. So ideally, no facial images. And if you are going to take pictures of the patient or videos of the patient, make sure that we can't see the patient's face. Now, I'm going to talk about informed consent again later on, but as I said, what we want you to do is involve the patient in the manuscript. rather than thinking of the manuscript as an entity that you write, and then later on you have to find the patient and get consent just for the sake of publication, as if it's a rite of passage or a task that needs to be ticked off. Think of informed consent in a different way. Think that this learning that you're doing is bedside learning. Now, you'd never see a patient at the bedside and start teaching someone else at the patient's bedside without asking the patient if it's all right first, and without asking them while you're doing the teaching to contribute to what you're saying. And that's exactly the same thing here. Because this is online bedside learning, please get informed consent. Informed consent means the patient has seen the manuscript, they've approved it, they get to add their own view in their own words, and we'll talk about that again later. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the peer review process in a minute, but what I want to make clear is that we do actually want to publish your manuscript. We're not looking for loopholes to reject it. So if you can really find something that you can present in a new way, or something that's new to learn, something that's perfectly described with images that are memorable instantly and perfectly illustrate what I need to know without my having to look for another book or to look up something in Wikipedia, dare I say. If it's all there, then the reviewer comments that you'll be asked to address will probably just probe you a little bit more about the patient's history. For that reason, as I said from the beginning, involve the patient from the start so that it's not difficult for you to check things again with the patient. It's not difficult for you to contact the patient. It's not difficult for you to update your follow-up. The publishing process takes time. Your follow-up, by the time your manuscript is ready to be printed, will be an extra 2 or 3 months down the line. You'll have richer follow-up information to add. So do please, when you receive reviewer comments, take them in the spirit that they're intended and just add that additional information and make it easy for us to see that you've added it by marking the text. So let's go back to this online bedside learning. So the focus of this entire journal is it's bedside learning, the patient's part of it, and this is a patient that's right in front of you on the floor. Nothing rare, nothing weird, nothing difficult to find. You don't have to scratch your head to look for an interesting case. It's your run-of-the-mill work. Because we know that in run-of-the-mill work, we have challenges every day. So here's an example. What is new about the jugular venous pulse? Nothing. It's the first thing we learned. 35 years ago, it was the first thing I learned on the ward when I was seeing patients. And I nodded assiduously when someone said, can you see it? Can you see the pulse? Can you see it changing? And of course I couldn't see it. I was standing too far away. I was with friends. I didn't want to embarrass myself. Here you are, online learning. So there's no reason to feel embarrassed. You can take as much time as you need. You can make the picture bigger. And what I asked the authors to do is, this is a video. They've recorded the patient breathing in and breathing out, and you see the jugular venous pulse. You see the jugular vein distending and in its more collapsed state. And what I've asked them to do, and you can see it here, is I've asked them to superimpose the JVP trace so that when the video plays, you can see that in real time. Now that, even though it's nothing new, that is online bedside learning that's worth publishing. So that's the way to think about what should I publish. It's how you present information. Again, a caput medusa. This here is the umbilicus, and you can see it's all engorged with portosystemic venous anastomoses. And just to remind us why it's called a caput medusa, you've got Medusa's head here with all the snakes coming out of her head. And you've got a tiny little graphic here drawn by the authors themselves, just to remind us what causes this intrahepatic blockage that leads to portosystemic anastomosis. So it's all there. I don't have to go to a different website to look up what it is. It's akin to the books that we used to have in our white coats when we were medical students that we used to pull out there and then to look things up. Here it's all in one manuscript. And you don't have to spend a lot of time with fancy computer software. This is a beautifully hand-drawn diagram that explains to me what I needed to remember without looking it up, what the structures were within the inguinal canal. Now, talking of presenting information, let's think a little bit more about what you really need to know. Now, we don't know each other. You're telling me about your patient. I'm trying to follow this all in the narrative. Wouldn't it be easier just to have a graphic of the timeline? Now, what I don't want is, I don't want these dates here. Do you see that? And so what I would do is I would probably begin with index admission, a month earlier, 2 months earlier, 3 months earlier, 1 month later, etc., etc., etc. So you don't use the calendar dates. Don't use the month, don't use the day, don't use the year. Just write time of admission, 2 days after admission, 3 months before admission, 4 years before that, etc., etc. You can present this in any way you like, but having a timeline of what happened really helps the audience understand immediately what's happening with the patient. It's just so much better than just trying to work your way through text. And you can present your timeline in any way that's convenient to you. These are all fairly simple graphics that have been done on home computers. How to present results. A picture paints 1,000 words. So use graphics, use graphs, use the graphs and readouts that you get on your own machines at work, and try and get the best resolution you can. Here you go. This is someone whose growth hormone levels have been plotted against the change in height. It's perfect for understanding how this patient has grown and what those hormone levels have been as the patient has aged from childhood through teenagehood. This is a before and after picture. It's quite subtle to see, but they've very carefully made sure that the images are roughly the same size and I can compare before and after. And beneath that, they've put the change in weight and they've put the hormone levels. So do you see, it's all about how to present information. It's all about bringing that bedside online within a manuscript. Tell us about the mechanisms of disease. Draw the mechanisms yourself. This is a simple example of a biochemical pathway, and the authors have drawn it for us and sent it in to us. This is an example of what may happen in refeeding syndrome, and it's just so much easier to see it in a flowchart where I can try and work out the pathophysiology and understand it while at the same time I'm reading what they're explaining to me in their discussion. This again has been drawn by the authors, and it's explaining to us exactly what's happened in a patient, but in a graphical, pictorial way. So please go ahead and use your little graphics programs and draw your own illustrations. It's particularly marvelous in operative surgery. My background is general surgery, and I just wish when I was operating everything was labelled the way it is here. It is so difficult when you're teaching someone else surgery to get their heads right into the operating table and get them to touch and feel and see what it is you're trying to illustrate. You know that's not possible. Even your first officer, as it were, who's opposite you, doesn't see what you're seeing because, of course, he's seeing it from his angle. But here in an article, you can illustrate it beautifully. And you can also illustrate your images with videos. And I've shared examples of perfect videos with Ryan, and he can forward those to you in due course. In addition to that, you can show so much more about an operation. You can show where the lines of a fasciotomy might be. You can show what might be under the skin. It's just such an effective way of sharing knowledge with another clinician or with a medical student. This is just a simple picture that you might expect to see on a whiteboard in the residence room when you're trying to work out exactly where you want your lines to be in an osteotomy, but it's effective. So you don't have to go overboard with the graphics in order to produce effective learning, and this enhances substantially the manuscript and makes your chances of being accepted so much higher. And this is why it enhances it. It just enhances learning value. Think about it. I'm looking at an X-ray and I'm trying to describe it to you. And rather than just presenting the X-ray, you draw for me right beside the X-ray exactly what it is I need to focus my attention on. This is what we ask the authors to do. So we ask them in the revision, please can you mark the X-ray and beside it put a line diagram of where we should focus and what that anatomy actually is. And again, this time, rather than having to draw it themselves, they've used a simple graphics program. And it's right there. You're looking at the CT scan, and then you're looking at a little line diagram of that CT scan directly underneath. Can you see how that magnifies learning value? It is a no-brainer that this would be accepted. It's a little bit of extra work, but what you're trying to do is you're trying to teach someone at the bedside, but you can't see them, they can't see you, the patient's not directly in front of you, they're a million miles away on the other side of the world, and yet through this manuscript you've pretty much brought home everything that there is to learn, and they can really see it for themselves. Here's the last picture that I want to show you for the moment. And in this last picture, what you can see is that I'm looking at this angiogram and I'm trying to work out, yes, I can see the outline of the ribs just about, they've been subtracted. Think I can see the IVC, think I see the aorta. If you look at the illustration right beside the angiogram, you can see those structures on the angiogram immediately because they've just brought out to you. This is what we call enhancing the learning value. So it's not just the quality of the text, it's how well are you teaching someone else? How well are you presenting this information? So what is it that we want? We want the patient to be involved from the very beginning, and we want you to focus on learning value. And it doesn't have to be a new or rare disease. It just has to be a new way of learning, a new way of presenting information, or genuinely something new, but with a solid evidence base that you discuss yourselves. So, patient focus. All cases present some kind of a challenge. It's all just a question of how closely you are involved with that patient. Try and get all the up-to-date information you can. Get all the radiological information, get the histopathology slides. The number of times people send me a manuscript and I ask them, do you have a video of the operation? It's a robotic operation and they didn't save the video. Why? The number of times I've asked people, do you have the original histopathology slides? No, we don't have it, we can't access it. The patient was treated in a different hospital, but that's so central in the description that the patient has it's so central in the description the authors have provided. How can that information not be there? Get it all together at the time that you're downloading our template. And if you look at the template, it's a reminder again of what it is you need all in one place. You just get typing. Now, please, please do not list differential diagnoses. The whole purpose of this exercise is to tease out the diagnosis, to work out why is it this and why is it not that. And in order to do that, we have to see your thinking. Ideally, I'd like to see your thought processes diagrammatically. You know, if it's not this, it's this, those algorithms that we were all brought up with. But I also want to see that in the description. So don't list the diagnosis. Show us how you worked it out, how you got to your working diagnosis, how perhaps you adjusted your working diagnosis depending on a response to treatment, depending on time. As a general surgeon, within the first 24 hours, I wasn't sure exactly what was wrong with a patient a lot of times. I'm from the era where a patient didn't routinely get a CT scan on admission. And those difficult decisions, we need to know why they were difficult. We need to know the context. So please don't present them without that additional context. Now, from the patient's point of view, when people see that it helps to include the patient's perspective, they think, okay, well, I'll just get the patient to write a line so that everyone knows that the patient was involved. That is not what we're after. what we want to know is, what was it really like for the patient to go through this? How did they know that they were ill? What did they think it was? What were they thinking of? Oftentimes, patients aren't thinking about their symptoms. They're thinking about what's going to happen to the rest of the family. I can't go to the hospital today because I've got 2 little ones that I've got to look after, and I can't stay overnight because no one's at home with the kids. That needs to be there in the case report, because it is part of our routine, everyday clinical work, and it hugely informs the decisions we make. I often used to send patients home knowing that they were best watched by their parents, and then if anything happened with the child, they would come straight back. That needs to be reflected. So the patient perspective is not, yes, I'm very happy with the hospital, or, oh, I think the doctors are marvelous, oh, I'm so glad to be part of this new treatment and to have experienced it. No, we want more than that. Now, after they've gone home, we want to know how they are in follow-up. Now, from a general surgical point of view, I was just happy that my patient survived, and I was happy to learn months later when I see them in clinic how different they look. And I was happy to learn that they're now getting on with their lives. They're now able to drive. They're now able to get on with their work. And we want to know that. We want to know how patients reintegrate into their lives, reintegrate into society, how they live with disability, the adjustments that they make. Those are crucial. So that should be in the patient perspective. And the patient perspective should be written by the patient, or if necessary, the patient's next of kin. But it should be written as if it's the patient who's speaking to us. So it's, I did this, I found this, it was like this for me in hospital. Please don't paraphrase for the patient or write it in the third person. Having said that, because we can't publish manuscripts unless they show your work in the best light possible, grammar errors or colloquialisms that need to be explained, they need to be dealt with, please, by the authors. So when you're looking at the patient perspective, please check the grammar and check for syntax and typos. One last thing about the patient perspective, it doesn't matter how long or how short it is. What matters is that we know, whichever language they've spoken in, that you're transcribing it for the patient, but it is in the patient's voice, and it really is what happened to the patient themselves. Okay, now, in terms of the patient perspective, all the rules that we talked about in writing the text apply. We don't want to, after having meticulously anonymized the text that you write as clinicians, then be able to identify the patient immediately from all the things in the patient perspective. Very common for there to be calendar dates written there, for the patient to write about their children. Try not to expose the families of the patients, and try to put the personal exposure of the patient to a minimum, while at the same time you're balancing that with enough personal information to really give us insight into what it's like to live with disease. Now, before I go into informed consent, I'm just going to take a moment just to recap on a couple of things that might seem contradictory to you. We want the patient to be involved in the manuscript. We want you to have informed consent, but at the same time, we don't want the patient to be easily recognizable. So please give that information, but hide the face of the patient and hide personal details, such as the exact occupation or the exact place that the patient lives or works, the exact calendar dates when they develop their symptoms, and the exact hospital where they were treated. You can work some of this out anyway from the author affiliations, but we don't want it to be obvious that the patient's exposed unduly. So that leads nicely onto informed consent, and I'm going to conclude with a little discussion about informed consent. Why is it necessary? Informed consent wasn't always necessary for writing case reports, and I remember as a junior doctor writing them, and I didn't have a journal consent form that I had to take to the patient and complete. But even though I didn't have that consent form, I absolutely had the patient's consent to publish. And the patient was very much involved and wanted a copy of the published article when it was published. And so rather than thinking of the consent as a form, think of informed consent as this is a contract between you and the patient for the patient to be used as an illustration of a disease, or the patient's life to be used as an illustration of a global health problem. We're not talking about global health today, but I'll explain more about that on a different occasion. Now, if that patient is involved, and if we're using patient material, it is absolutely essential in the modern age that the patient knows exactly what has been said about them. So they're not just consenting to the fact that their information is used. They're looking at the manuscript, they're approving the manuscript, they're adding to the manuscript, and yet at the same time, not adding so much information that they're easily recognizable. So that consent form is important. Try to make sure that it's signed by hand. It's difficult to do. We've just come through a pandemic where we were accepting recordings of conversations that doctors had with patients. We were accepting electronic signatures. What we need to know in the office is that all the correct things have been done and the patient is protected. These administrative things are not put in place to cause unnecessary delays for authors. And so what I'll say is that please go to the consent form page. Please have a good look at it. If the patient can't consent for some reason, if the patient has passed away, if the patient has died, then you can get consent from the next of kin. But that next of kin that you get consent from should be close to the patient and should be in a position to approve what's been written, to make comment on its veracity, and also to take responsibility for that patient information being out there in the online sphere. Because as you know, once we have published it, it's not unusual for the newspaper media or social media to look at what we've published and then for them to go and publish that themselves. Once it's out there online, it's out there. So please take consent seriously. If you have any doubts about it, you can write to us directly, and you can write to me directly, and we will share our details with you. So, patient first, online bedside learning, and we are not looking to reject, we are looking to accept. Make it easy for us. Look at the instructions, type directly into the template, stay in touch with us and get in touch with us early if you have a query. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and hand you back to Ryan. Thank you.
Quite a few questions have come in. I've written them down, so thank you so much. There have been quite a few of the listeners who want to know if they can have a copy of the slides. I think some of you have received a response already. As soon as the actual video recording is available, we will share that with you. You'll be receiving an email from us, so no need to stress. It will be coming very soon. Seema, you mentioned the consent form. There was a great question here, Dr. Biswas, coming in about if the institution has their own consent forms that sort of covers in detail everything that we have in our own consent form, would that suffice? Can the institution use their own consent form instead of the BMJ one?
Thank you, Ryan. It's a great question. It's an extremely sensible question. Now, it took a long time for us to design our consent forms, and what I'd like you to do, and the real answer to this question, is download our consent form now, look at it and compare it to your institutional consent form. Because so much of the material that we have at BMJ Case Reports is available to other people in the world who are subscribers or have fellowships to BMJ Case Reports, you know that that patient information will be transferred to somebody else. It will also be used within the BMJ. So I also work in another part of the BMJ and write exam questions. It's not unheard for me to use an X-ray or a CT scan image from a BMJ case report and use it for an exam question, which is targeted at a completely different audience, perhaps. Now, that requires very careful consent, and that's what's entailed in our consent forms. So if we can see that you've got an institutional consent form, you absolutely cannot get the BMJ consent form signed if we can see that on the institutional consent form, every single aspect of what we're looking for in the BMJ consent form is covered, then you're fine. But if it's not, and usually it isn't, we can't accept that case report. Our policies have evolved over years of things that have come back to bite us, things that have harmed the patient, things that have concerned the patient, and also the way the world has changed and the way social media has changed the world. And so we are extremely strict about consent. If you can, please find a patient who's there in front of you on the floor. That's how I started the presentation. And get our consent form out there and then. And let the patient read it to their heart's content. At least the patient has the form. If that patient is engaged from the outset, then it's very likely that they can sign that form at any time, but your relationship is such that you won't lose touch with the patient. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I hope so. So hopefully that answer will suffice. But there is another question regarding consent, and if the patient is no longer living or can't be found, what do we do then?
Okay, if the patient can't be found, it is extremely unlikely that we will accept the manuscript. So before you subscribe, before you submit, do everything you can to find the patient, because we hardly ever waive consent because someone cannot find the patient. Because it is so easy to locate patients and find out more about them, and for them to have unwanted visitors, we are extremely careful about what we publish now. And even if there's a lot to learn from the manuscript, because we know it is impossible to fully anonymize a manuscript, without consent, we won't publish. Now, if the patient has died, but you're in touch with the family and the family want this case to be published, we need to know that. And you can get the next of kin to sign a consent form. And if you have a moment now to look at our website, you'll see that we have a consent form in particular for deceased patients, and the next of kin can sign. Now, that's notable because you'll know as clinicians that it is very rare that we ever ask the next of kin to sign a clinical consent form. In the UK, 2 clinicians will sign a form to go ahead and perform a procedure if the patient can't give consent, but you never ask the next of kin, and it has no legal validity if you ask the next of kin. In fact, it's a problem. In publication and at BMJ Case Report, that is not a problem. You can ask the next of kin, but ask the right next of kin, the person that really knows the patient. We keep going back to the point that you really have to write these with your patient. Don't let consent become an issue.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Another question in regards to getting published. There's a question that came in and said, why does the journal reject preprint articles?
That's a difficult question. I just submitted a manuscript last week and it was rejected. A manuscript that I wrote myself, and I had to double check that they hadn't, because they sent an automated email to me saying that they encourage authors to let their articles appear as preprint versions. I had to write to them and say, can you please assure me that you have not, having rejected my article, put up a preprint version of it online? Because I know that when I send it to another journal, they will do what we do at BMJ Case Reports. They will do a check for overlapping text. And if they do a check for overlapping text, and that article is essentially published online, okay, it's not published by a journal online, but it is published online, then it is a duplicate publication. Now, we can argue about that, and it's a good argument to have. We don't have time for it right now, but I'd like to leave enough time for you to come back to me about my answer. So basically, we regard it as a duplicate publication, and that's why. And that's why I was so sure to ask the journal that rejected my paper to make sure that they confirm it's not in preprint, because then I can't submit it somewhere. I can't submit it knowing that it's already available online. Okay, it's not officially published, but it's there. It's there. It's a publication. It's in print. Everyone can see it. Jenny, do you want to add to that?
Sure. So I was just going to add to that. For us, it's also a consent issue. So as Seema just explained, we place a lot of value on patient consent, and our consent form is very sort of BMJ Case Reports specific. So for them, the authors to publish to post the patient information and the case on a different website that is not directly linked to BMJ Case Reports, we felt sort of ethically that that wasn't quite comfortable with us.
Well, thank you so much. We are just over by a minute, so I'm going to wrap things up, and please, let's keep the conversation going. If you do have any questions, please reach out to the email that you see right on your screen. We will get to those questions as quickly as possible. As I mentioned to those of you that have asked, you will have a copy of the recording as soon as the video is available. I'd like to take this moment to thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you to all the BMJ colleagues that make today happen. It's very much appreciated. And of course, Dr. Biswas, having your perspective, being able to speak with our customers, I think it's really great. So thank you for joining us. I know it's getting late overseas for you. And just a quick wrap up, now that you've heard a little bit more about BMJ Case Reports, you've seen the value that it brings to the institution, not just the publication aspect, but the learning aspect for the users. So keep in mind as you browse the website, if you take a look at some more information that we have, and again, please reach out to us